All right, hey, we're back with another episode of the best t-shirt I ever printed. And on this episode, we're going to hear from industry legend Charlie Taublieb with Taublieb Consulting about the best t-shirt he ever printed. And this guy's been around forever, so I know he's going to have something just remarkable for us. So how you doing today, Charlie?
Doing great. How's everything on your end, Marshall?
It's fantastic, and you've printed so many shirts, and you've been around for and made such an impact on the industry. I can't wait to hear what you have for us. So, what is your favorite T-shirt that you've printed that you have for us today?
So I actually have a number of them because the last time I actually printed legitimately was probably 1981, because at about 1982 I got into sales. So all of the printing that I was totally responsible for happened between 1976 and 1981 or 82. And the company that I owned at the time was called Great American Screen Designs in Brooklyn, New York. And we printed bootleg rock and roll. That's how we got into the industry. We did get into legitimate sides as well. Those were never as much fun to do. I'm not sure if we ever made money. I know we handled a lot of money, but I'm not sure if we ever kept much of it. In any event, I have a series of shirts which I will send over to you, or actually the images. I no longer own any of the shirts, which is kind of interesting. I was talking to my wife about it. When we moved to Denver in 1982, I hired a babysitter for my daughter because we were going out that night. And as it turns out, he stole all of my rock shirts out of my closet. So whatever shirts I did have were gone. But the ones that I want to show are ones that are found in a particular book. And even the author says he doesn't know who actually printed them because they're all bootleg shirts, and this is his collection. So I went through and found a bunch of the things that came out of my factory, starting from 1977 with a Led Zeppelin shirt, which I did love. And one of the things you'll notice when you do show these images, the designs we did were huge, especially compared to today. As a matter of fact, on many of the shirts, from left to right, you can't see the edges of the image because the shirts are ones that he actually owned and cut the sleeves off and did a bunch of things to. But the Led Zeppelin shirt, I think, is the most interesting one for me, only because it was one of the earliest ones. It was done in 1977. I got into this in July of 76. The reason it's interesting, I started out on screen print tables. I had 200-foot long tables, and print tables were made for cut parts, not for finished goods. And so when you printed finished goods, of course, the bottom of the shirt was being held in place, but the top of the shirt would move. And so the artists that were working for me had to design in such a way that even if the image moved, it would still look good. And because of the printing technique at that time, which was printing from darkest color to lightest color on a black shirt, you always printed white last, and the white always had to make everything look really crisp and vibrant and as though it were in register. In looking at the Led Zeppelin shirt, you'll notice that the type at the top, which is white and yellow, about a quarter to a half inch out of register. Nevertheless, obviously the shirt sold because this is part of the guy's collection. And I noticed in going through his book, he owned a bunch of stuff that came out of my factory, not all of which were printed very well, I would say, but nevertheless, not too bad. The Rolling Stone shirt, when you get to it, you'll notice is kind of washed out. We never knew if the ink was going to dry or not correctly going through the dryer. The one thing we did have that was in our favor was no one knew who printed it, so we never had any returns.
That's great. And so they all had a vintage look anyway on purpose, just because of how you did them.
You know, the designing was always a critical part. The printing of the image was always done the same way. It was always darkest to lightest. The colors we used were all from Union ink, and they still exist today. As a matter of fact, we ordered so much at one time that they finally put it in as part of their line versus a custom color. So it was always blues, greens, and purples first, then came orange, yellow, and then white. Red was horrible at that time, so it was never used. Even though in the images it appears to be red, it was really an orange. But the Led Zeppelin shirt was definitely one of my favorite ones. I remember it's a 5-color design, and I remember we forgot one color once. It didn't really matter. It sold anyway. When you're dealing with a rock and roll crowd that's stoned back in the 70s, you could get away with anything you wanted and nobody really worried about it. The shirt that I think is really most interesting, and there are quite a few, is the King Tut Shirt. And the only reason I say that is I still have the film from that from back in 1979. So that was a shirt that was designed for the Metropolitan Museum of Art for the King Tut exhibit that was supposed to come out in 1980, which it did. And at that time, I think it was either a 5 or 6 color design that we did. They turned it down because, quote unquote, it was too expensive, and they went with somebody else's 1-color shirt. And being who we were and what we were, we printed up a bunch of them and bootlegged in front of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. We had no shame. But the first time I actually got to speak formally was at the Technical Symposium in Pittsburgh for, at that time, what became SGIA, or Printing United today. But back then, I think it was still called SPA or SPAI. I don't know, it's gone through so many transformations. But I got to speak in Pittsburgh, and I knew that a bunch of people were coming to that particular symposium specifically to shoot down what I had to say about how to print the black shirts. So what I did was I printed up about 350 black pellons with the King Tut design on it, and with my logo on the bottom. And as you came in, you were handed one of these pellons that had the print on it. So when it was my turn to speak, fortunately, the person in front of me had gone overtime because I really didn't know how to talk at all formally at that time. And so instead of having a half hour, it was cut down to 15 minutes, which was perfect. And I'm not sure if anyone understood what I had to say, but I was so nervous. There were about 300 people in the room. I was so nervous that my teeth were banging together to the point where I'm not sure if I heard myself. But in any event, at the end, I didn't get any questions about or get shot down for what I was saying, because everybody in the room had a print of the King Tut image. And so that's become one of those iconic images for me. And fortunately, I still have that artwork. Printed it when I was in Egypt at the beginning of the year. And if the shows ever start again, I do want to print it. So I have it as a 5-color print going on a black shirt with no flash. And I think the biggest thing is everyone today lives on what a flash unit does. And not only one, but sometimes 2 and 3. When I go overseas, I've gone into a shop where they had a 20-color automatic with 9 flash units on it. And the reality is the quality of work back then certainly doesn't hold up to today's quality, but the technical aspects, I think, were far greater, because you really had to think through your design, the way you were separating it, the way it was going to come together in print order. It really had to be thought out, as opposed to just saying, well, here's all my colors. You know what? I'll just flash in between and not worry about what's going to happen. But anyway, the other shirts that I think you'll get a kick out of, probably one of my favorites is the Bob Dylan shirt. Being a Dylan fan, I'm always into that. I think my Dylan shirt blows away the type of shirts that you see nowadays. But there are quite a few. The one shirt that's on there that is not from the old series is my Bullseye shirt. It was a design that Dane Clement did for me for my, I used to own a supply house. And so for our 11th annual open house, he airbrushed together the image, which we then sent out to Chrome Seps, had them do the separations, and that's what we printed at the open house. It's a 4-color process design. And we entered it at the SGIA show, and it took a silver, which was kind of unorthodox for us because we're really not printers at that time. We were into sales. But I think of all the shirts that I still play around with, I think the King Tut probably has the best history in terms of what it had to go through to get to where it is, between the Metropolitan Museum of Art rejecting it. It being the very first time I ever spoke formally at a conference, and now getting a chance to print it again, it shows. So looking forward to doing that either manually or automatically. It prints great either way.
So way back when you were doing the long tables, wooden screens, what was the mesh? Did you even measure tension? What? Give us the rundown on that. I'm very fascinated about that.
Oh, okay, well, I can give you a full rundown. As a matter of fact, I have an article on how to even build your own table, which I probably should republish. Tables were 100 feet long. There was actually a company in New Jersey called Precision Screen Tables that made these, and they guaranteed them to be parallel and flat for at least a year. 100-foot table at that time probably ran about $3,500, and it was 60 inches wide. You had metal rails on either side with metal stoppers so that you had a specific distance between prints. And they were covered with a heavy felt and then had vinyl pulled over them. You would then print out a pattern at each station so you knew exactly where to place your garment. And it was generally somewhere around an 18 to a 24-inch repeat. I know on my two tables, if I did a full round, it was 8 2/3 dozen T-shirts. When you printed, each color required a person. So to do a 6-color job, you actually needed 10 people. You needed one person dropping the goods in place, 2 people pinning them down because it did take time to pin. Then you had, each person had a screen. So we would have one behind the other, all printing, because this is all plastisol that we were using. Prior to plastisol, we used text dyes, but even there we printed wet on wet. And then you had one person at the end pulling the shirt up and either feeding it to the dryer, or if it was a text dye, hanging it over a line. Depending on how fast your guys were, you could produce quite a bit. So my guys were fast and skinny. You never had the chance of getting fat doing this, but we could probably do about 50 shirts an hour. So 50 dozen an hour. So we could do about 600 shirts an hour, but it took 10 people to do that.
Wow. And the screens, because you mentioned that the Led Zeppelin shirt was huge. They're not your standard screen width, the size, right? These are bigger screens, like oversized jumbos.
We were using 2331 screens, but remember, we could just go as wide or as tall as we wanted. It didn't really matter. We didn't have pallets that we had to hit. So the screens were always made of wood, wood, which we made on our own. You had 2 eye screws that went into the bottom, which would hit up against the rail, the angle iron rail. And you also had an L bracket on top, which would hit the stopper that was on the angle iron rail. That's how you got your registration. And registration was dead on the money. When you're on print tables, it's easy to keep perfect registration. The only reason we went out is because we were printing on finished goods instead of on cut parts. And so on cut parts, of course, you don't have any movement. And that's why when you go overseas to the Asian countries and stuff, they're always using print tables besides automatics and manual presses, because they can get extremely accurate and maintain that accuracy from, so our screen mesh at the time is a mesh you don't see today. It was a 93 versus an 86 or a 110. So it held a little bit more detail than an 86. I don't know what the thread diameter was. As far as tension, no. When you staple wood, when you staple the mesh onto a wooden screen, the tension is not going to be there.
It's a backyard screen door.
Oh, screen doors probably had more tension than what we had. But when I did go to my first SGIA show or SPA show in 1977. In 1978 or 79 is when I saw Newman roller frames, and it was at the Diplomat Hotel in Hollywood, Florida. I don't remember if it was 78 or 79, but I bought my first dozen roller frames at that time. Couldn't really get to using them. They didn't resemble what today's frames look like. They didn't know enough about softening corners, etc. but I bought them because the guys who were in the room before me came from a huge company in New Jersey that did graphics printing. And they were impressed by the fact that the screen that Don showed them had 15 Newtons. And it was like, oh my God, 15 Newtons. That's amazing. So they bought about $10,000 worth of frames. I bought a dozen of them. And they probably sat around for about a year before I could figure out how to make them work.
That's interesting. All right. Well, thank you so much for that wonderful story, Charlie. I love hearing about that stuff. Appreciate you, buddy. Thanks for watching this episode of the best t-shirt I ever printed. For more content like this, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks.